My daughter refused to let me meet her fiance's parents, looking me dead in the eye and swearing they wouldn't even be at her own wedding. So I secretly went to see them myself, and what I discovered playing out in front of me changed my life forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth. I am Harrison Blake. I am 70 years old, and I live in a quiet, established neighborhood in Philadelphia. I stood in the middle of my living room, the pale winter light casting long, cold shadows across the hardwood floors. In my rough hands, I held a fragile glass ornament. It was a delicate silver angel that my late wife Diane had bought during our very first Christmas together. My hands are heavily calloused, scarred from a lifetime of pulling heavy copper wires, pouring wet concrete, and building a massive commercial construction and heating empire from absolutely nothing. Those hands felt too clumsy, too heavy for something so incredibly fragile. But I held on to it anyway, brushing my thumb over the silver wings. It had been 5 years since Diane passed away. Every December since she left, I pulled out these heavy cardboard boxes. It was a quiet ritual, a way to keep her warm memory alive in a house that felt entirely too large and far too quiet without her laughter filling the halls. I was wrapping a thick piece of green garland around the oak banister of the staircase when my cell phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and smiled when I saw the name on the screen. It was my daughter, Morgan. She was 28 years old, living a glamorous life in Manhattan, living a life I had completely funded with my own sweat, blood, and sleepless nights. I answered the phone with a smile, asking her what time she planned to drive down for the holidays. I told her I was just putting up the angel she loved so much as a little girl. But there was no warmth on the other end of the line. There was no greeting, just a cold, flat statement that immediately dropped the temperature in the room. Dad, I am not coming home for Christmas this year. I am spending it with Carter. The words hit me hard, knocking the wind out of my lungs for a brief second. Carter Kensington was the man she was supposed to marry on New Year's Eve, just 3 short weeks away. I swallowed the bitter lump of disappointment forming in my throat. I told myself it was normal. She was starting a new life. She was building her own traditions. I tried to keep my voice light and supportive. I told her I understood, and then I offered a compromise. I suggested that I could fly up to New York for the weekend instead. I told her it was the perfect opportunity for me to finally sit down and meet Carter's parents. It felt absolutely ridiculous to me that the wedding was only 3 weeks away, and the two families had not even shared a single cup of coffee together. I offered to book a table at the best steakhouse in the city entirely on my dime. The silence on the line grew thick and heavy. When Morgan finally spoke, her tone had shifted completely. It was no longer just dismissive. It was sharp, defensive, and incredibly cold. No, Dad. You cannot come here. Under no circumstances are you to come to New York. I stood frozen by the staircase, the green garland slipping from my fingers and dropping to the floor. I asked her why. I asked her what the problem was. I am her father. I spent over $4 million throughout her life to ensure she never had to struggle for a single second. I paid for the elite private schools where she rubbed elbows with old money. I paid for her Ivy League tuition. I paid the exorbitant rent for her luxury apartment in the city. I sacrificed my own youth so she could have everything. Why was I suddenly being treated like a shameful secret? Dad, please do not make this difficult. She sighed, a sound full of heavy irritation. You just would not fit in with them. I gripped the phone tighter, my calloused fingers digging into the plastic case. I looked down at my hands. They were not the soft, perfectly manicured hands of a Wall Street banker or a generational trust fund kid. They were the hands of a blue-collar worker who had fought tooth and nail for his slice of the American dream. I built a company that employed hundreds of people. I was a respected man in my industry. But to my own daughter, to the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders, I was just an embarrassment in a tailored suit. I tried to reason with her. I kept my voice incredibly calm, though my heart was hammering violently against my ribs. I told her that regardless of our different backgrounds, We were about to become family. We had to meet eventually. We had to sit in the same church. We had to celebrate at the same reception. It was simply the respectful thing to do. Morgan let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded nothing like the sweet girl Diane and I had raised. Don't try to come to New York, Dad. It is a waste of time. Carter's parents will not even be at the wedding anyway, so there is absolutely no point in you meeting them. Before I could process the sheer absurdity of that statement, before I could ask why a prominent wealthy family would casually skip their only son's wedding, the line went completely dead. She hung up on me. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a black coffee. I stood by the window watching the frost gather on the glass. I thought about the days when I started my business. I drove a rusted-out van with a broken heater working 80-hour weeks, coming home covered in fiberglass dust and industrial grease. I did it happily just so Morgan could take private equestrian lessons and wear dresses I could never have afforded at her age. I built a fortress of wealth to protect my family from the harshness of the world. But standing there drinking bitter coffee in an empty, echoing kitchen, I realized the bitter truth. My wealth had not protected my relationship with my daughter. It had funded her arrogance. It had given her the means to look down on the very hands that fed her. And now this ridiculous lie about the wedding. A society family abandoning a New Year's Eve wedding. It was physically impossible to believe. The Kensingtons were the kind of people who hired public relations teams to manage their dinner parties. They would never allow the social embarrassment of missing their son's nuptials. Morgan was lying. She was lying to my face, using my love as a blindfold. I walked over to my desk and sat down in the heavy leather chair. I opened the drawer and pulled out the thick file containing the wedding expenses I had already signed off on. Hundreds of thousands of dollars transferred without a single second thought, all because I wanted to give my little girl the perfect, flawless day she always dreamed of. I had written the massive checks, but I had been kept entirely in the dark about the actual logistical details. Every time I asked about the catering, the venue, or the guest list, Morgan brushed me off, saying she had a wedding planner handling the boring stuff. My daughter had drawn a harsh line in the sand, explicitly forbidding me from crossing it, but she had severely underestimated the man she was dealing with. I was not a foolish, lonely old man who could be easily brushed aside, pacified, and locked away in a closet. I was Harrison Blake. I built massive commercial empires out of dirt, sweat, and steel. If she thought she could shut me out of her life, treat me like a shameful peasant, all while quietly spending my life savings, she was gravely mistaken. I was going to find out exactly what was happening in New York, even if I had to march up there and tear her entire fabricated world apart to uncover the ugly truth. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. I stood completely still, quietly staring at the phone in my hand, as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, matching the sudden chill that had settled deep within my chest. I slowly poured the bitter liquid down the sink and watched it swirl into the drain. My sprawling stone colonial felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. I walked out of the kitchen and moved slowly down the main hallway, my boots echoing loudly against the polished oak floors. Every single room I passed was a painful reminder of everything I had built. There was the grand dining room where we used to host chaotic, joyful holiday dinners. There was the living room still half decorated with the green garland I had dropped just moments ago. And there were the photographs lining the walls. Pictures of Morgan as a toddler sitting on my shoulders at a construction site. Pictures of her high school graduation, smiling brightly with Diane and me on either side of her. I traced my calloused thumb over the glass of a silver frame. I had spent my entire adult life making sure my daughter never knew the meaning of hardship. I had worked double shifts in the bitter cold and breathed in concrete dust just so she could sleep soundly. I had shielded her from the harsh realities of the world. Now she was using that very privilege to lock me out of her life. I walked into the formal sitting room and sat heavily on the edge of a velvet armchair. My mind began to tally the staggering financial contributions I had made over the last decade. It was a habit I had developed in business, running the numbers to assess the damage. I had poured over $4 million into Morgan's life since she turned 18. I paid the exorbitant tuition for her elite Ivy League university. When she decided she wanted to live in Manhattan after graduation, I did not hesitate. I secured a luxury high-rise apartment for her, covering the astronomical monthly rent, so she could focus on her unpaid internships in the fashion industry. I paid off her credit cards whenever she swiped too eagerly at designer boutiques. I funded her extravagant European vacations because she claimed she needed to broaden her cultural horizons. I never complained. I never held the money over her head. I considered it my absolute duty as a father to provide an impenetrable launchpad for her ultimate success. I wanted her to be a sophisticated woman who could walk into any room and command respect. But I never imagined that she would use that sophisticated education to look down on the man who paid for it. She viewed my rough hands not as the foundation of her success, but as a shameful stain on her polished image. She was perfectly happy to spend my hard-earned money, but she was entirely unwilling to be seen with me in public. The audacity of her entitlement struck me like a physical blow. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, my jaw clenching. I needed to hear her voice again. I needed to demand a real, honest explanation for this sudden cruelty. I dialed Morgan's number. It rang once, twice. Then it abruptly cut straight to her automated voicemail greeting. She was actively screening my calls. I ended the connection and took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing pulse. I was not going to let this go easily. I navigated to my contacts and found the number for Carter, her fiance. I had only spoken to the young man a handful of times over the phone, mostly brief, superficial conversations where he sounded polite but incredibly rushed. I pressed the call button. The line connected, and I heard a single short ring. Before the second ring could even begin, the call was abruptly terminated. The screen displayed a message indicating the call could not be completed. He had blocked me. Carter Kensington, a man I had never formally met, a man whose upcoming wedding I was heavily financing, had the unmitigated gall to block my phone number. The realization sent a fresh surge of cold fury coursing through my veins. They coordinated this. They were actively strategizing to keep me completely isolated and ignorant in Philadelphia while they played house in New York on my dime. My daughter and her future husband had decided I was a nuisance to be managed and discarded at their convenience. I pushed myself up from the velvet armchair and walked purposefully down the hall toward my private study. It was a masculine room filled with dark mahogany bookshelves, rolled-up architectural blueprints, and the faint scent of old paper. I walked over to my heavy oak desk and opened the top right drawer. Inside was a stack of mail and various documents I had set aside. I pulled out a glossy high-end society magazine that Morgan had mailed to me 2 months ago. It featured a multi-page spread announcing her engagement. I had merely glanced at the photographs of them in Central Park and felt generic pride. But now, driven by a sharp, probing instinct, I opened the magazine and began to read the actual text of the article carefully. I scanned the paragraphs detailing their romance and future plans. Then my eyes locked onto a specific section detailing Carter's family background. The article described Richard and Patricia Kensington not just as successful professionals, but as absolute pillars of elite New York society. They were prominent philanthropists, board members of prestigious museums, and heirs to a massive legacy of old money. They hosted lavish galas, and their faces splashed across social registers. I stared at the glossy page, my mind racing as the gears of logic began to turn. The pieces of Morgan's story were colliding, creating a massive, glaring contradiction. My daughter had just told me that Carter's parents were completely skipping their only son's wedding. But people like Richard and Patricia Kensington, individuals whose entire existence revolved around public image, high society networking, and maintaining flawless optics, would never simply skip a milestone event like a wedding. It would be a monumental social scandal. It would be social suicide in their circles. Such a blatant absence would invite endless gossip and speculation, which was the very thing people of their stature spent millions to avoid. Morgan's excuse made absolutely no sense. Why would a family obsessed with public perception willingly miss their only son's nuptials? The answer was simple and terrifying. They were not skipping the wedding. The wedding was happening, and the Kensingtons were undoubtedly going to be there. I was the only parent being systematically excluded. I slowly closed the magazine and placed it flat on my desk. The plausible lie my daughter had constructed was cracking under the weight of basic logic. The question was no longer if she was lying to me. The real question was why she was going to such extreme, desperate lengths to keep me completely hidden from her new family. The heavy silence of my house was broken the following morning by the aggressive crunch of tires on my gravel driveway. I was sitting at the kitchen island, staring at the same cold cup of coffee, when I heard the low, unmistakable purr of a high-performance engine. I stood up and walked over to the bay window. Pulling up to the front steps was Morgan stepping out of a brand-new Porsche Macan. The sleek black paint gleamed under the pale winter sun, a sharp contrast to the worn-out, dependable pickup trucks I had driven my entire life. I watched her slam the driver's side door. She was moving with a frantic, disjointed energy that immediately put me on high alert. Before I could even make it out of the kitchen, the heavy oak front door flew open. Morgan rushed into the foyer, dropping her designer handbag onto the entry table with a loud thud. Her face was flushed, her mascara was slightly smudged beneath her eyes, and her breathing was ragged. It was the exact picture of a young woman in deep distress. She looked up and saw me standing at the edge of the hallway. Without a single word of greeting, without any of the cold defiance she had projected over the phone just 12 hours prior, she let out a broken sob and practically ran into my arms. I caught her on pure instinct, my large calloused hands holding her shaking shoulders. She buried her face into my chest, her tears soaking through the fabric of my flannel shirt. I stood there, stroking her hair, the anger from the previous night, warring with the deeply ingrained instinctual need to comfort my crying child. I asked her what was wrong, keeping my voice low and steady. She pulled back slightly, her hands trembling as she wiped her eyes. She looked up at me, her expression a masterclass in vulnerability, and began to weave her story. She told me that everything she said on the phone was true, but she had been too ashamed and overwhelmed to explain the real reasons behind it. According to Morgan, Carter's parents were not the respectable, polished society figures the magazines made them out to be. She claimed they were absolute monsters. She described Richard and Patricia Kensington as incredibly toxic, narcissistic, and deeply manipulative people who used their massive wealth to control every single aspect of their son's life. She told me they had threatened to cut Carter off entirely if he did not marry a woman from their specific social circle, a woman with a generational pedigree instead of a father who worked with his hands. Morgan sobbed harder, explaining how Carter had bravely stood up to them. She claimed he had completely severed all ties with his family just to be with her, walking away from his massive inheritance to protect their future. She painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture of a young couple fighting against the cruel elitism of high society. She said the reason she snapped at me on the phone was because she was terrified. She was terrified that if I reached out to them or if I showed up in New York, the Kensingtons would use their power and influence to destroy the quiet, peaceful life she and Carter were desperately trying to build. I listened to every word she said, feeling the weight of her tears. But as she spoke, a quiet, persistent voice echoed in the very back of my mind. It was Diane, my beautiful, fiercely perceptive wife, Diane. I remembered a conversation we had in this very hallway when Morgan was a teenager, right after she had wrecked her first car and cried her way out of being grounded. Diane had looked at me with a mixture of love and profound frustration. She told me that I was a brilliant businessman, a shark in the boardroom, but when it came to Morgan, I was completely blind. She warned me that I was raising a girl who knew exactly how to weaponize my fatherly guilt. She said my weakness for Morgan's tears would eventually be my absolute undoing. Standing there holding my weeping 28-year-old daughter, Diane's warning rang louder than it ever had before. I pushed the memory aside and focused on the woman standing in front of me. Morgan took a deep, shuddering breath and looked me dead in the eye. Her next words were delivered with such agonizing sincerity that they almost broke my resolve. She told me she kept me away to protect me. She said she knew how proud I was of my blue-collar roots, how hard I had worked to build my company from the ground up. She claimed she could not bear the thought of letting people like the Kensingtons look down their noses at me. She told me they hated working-class people, that they viewed anyone without a trust fund as common dirt. If I had gone to New York to meet them, she insisted they would have done nothing but hurl vicious, elitist insults at my face. She said she was willing to sacrifice having her own father at her wedding, just to spare me that devastating humiliation. She framed her entire betrayal as a grand, selfless act of filial devotion. It was an incredibly brilliant, emotionally devastating performance. It hit every single vulnerability I possessed as a father, who had spent his life trying to be a shield for his family. A fierce, burning anger flared up in my chest. It was the primal rage of a father hearing that his child was tormented by arrogant snobs. I wanted to march into Manhattan and tear the Kensingtons apart for making my daughter cry. I pulled Morgan into a tight embrace, resting my chin on her head. I told her it was going to be all right, that I would not let anyone treat her that way. I murmured soothing words, letting her believe her performance had worked flawlessly. But as I held her, patting her back, my gaze drifted over her shoulder. I looked past her, my eyes landing directly on the wooden surface of the foyer entry table. Morgan had tossed her belongings there in her dramatic rush through the door. Sitting right next to her expensive leather handbag was the set of keys to her new Porsche. Attached to the heavy key fob was a thick strap of premium black leather. Stamped deeply into that leather in bold gold foil lettering was the official corporate logo for Kensington Holdings. It was the same family she had just sworn Carter had entirely cut out of his life. My heart went completely cold as the truth washed over me. My daughter was a magnificent liar, playing me for an absolute fool in my own home. She had driven here in a corporate vehicle owned by the people she claimed to despise. Her tears were a calculated distraction to keep me safely tucked away in Philadelphia. I continued to hold her, matching her fake warmth with my own silent deception. I knew I could no longer trust my own flesh. I gently released my hold on her shoulders and took a small step back, keeping my expression entirely neutral. Morgan sniffled, dabbing at the corners of her eyes with the sleeve of her expensive cashmere sweater. She looked around the grand foyer of the home I had built, intentionally avoiding my direct gaze as she gathered the rest of her fabricated story. She let out a long, trembling sigh, playing the part of the exhausted, heartbroken bride to absolute perfection. She told me that the immense pressure from Carter's parents had simply become too much to bear. According to her, Richard and Patricia Kensington had threatened to turn the entire wedding into a massive, humiliating spectacle. They had demanded total control over the guest list, the venue, and the catering, trying to transform her special day into a shallow networking event for their wealthy associates. Morgan claimed that when Carter finally put his foot down and told them to back off, the resulting argument had completely shattered the family. She described a terrifying shouting match that ended with Carter throwing his massive inheritance back in his father's angry face. She said the emotional toll had completely ruined the joy of planning a large traditional wedding. The grand celebration she had always dreamed of was now permanently tainted by their toxic influence. Because of all this terrible drama, she explained, they had made the extremely difficult decision to cancel the massive reception entirely. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading, asking me to understand their drastic change of plans. She said they were now going to host a micro-wedding, just 20 of their closest, most supportive friends gathering in a remote rented cabin tucked away deep in upstate New York. She described a quiet, rustic ceremony in the snow on New Year's Eve, far away from the judging eyes of high society. She swore to me that absolutely no parents were allowed to attend this new intimate gathering. It was not just me being excluded, she passionately insisted. It was a blanket rule they had established to ensure the Kensingtons could not crash the event and ruin the peaceful evening. She reached out and grabbed my calloused hands, squeezing them tightly. She promised me that once the dust settled and the holidays were completely over, the three of us would have our own private celebration. She said we would go to my favorite upscale steakhouse in Philadelphia during the second week of January to properly celebrate their new marriage. She begged me to just stay home, enjoy a quiet Christmas, and give them the space they desperately needed to navigate this incredibly stressful transition. It took every single ounce of unyielding discipline I possessed to keep my face from hardening into a mask of pure fury. I looked at my daughter, this deceitful stranger, wearing Morgan's beautiful face, and forced a gentle, understanding smile. I told her that I completely understood her situation. I assured her that her mental health and her peace of mind were the most important things in the world to me. I told her that if a quiet cabin in the freezing woods was what she and Carter truly needed to be happy, then she had my absolute blessing. The sheer overwhelming relief that washed over her features was immediate and profound. Her tense shoulders visibly relaxed, and the fabricated anxiety drained from her rigid posture. She truly believed her theatrical performance had worked flawlessly. She thought she had successfully managed the foolish, naive old man standing before her. She threw her arms around my neck one last time, thanking me profusely for being so incredibly understanding and endlessly supportive. She grabbed her designer handbag from the entry table and scooped up her keys, the heavy leather fob hidden perfectly in the palm of her delicate hand. I slowly walked her toward the heavy oak front door, playing the required role of the loving, accommodating father to the very bitter end. I opened the heavy door and stepped out onto the wide stone porch, pulling my worn flannel shirt tight against the biting winter chill. I watched Morgan practically skip down the concrete front steps, her dark mood entirely transformed now that she had firmly secured my physical absence. She walked confidently over to her sleek black Porsche Macan, a premium vehicle she had previously claimed she purchased as a used bargain with her own meticulously saved money. I stood completely still on the porch, my narrowed eyes tracking her movements as she opened the driver's side door and slid into the luxurious leather seat. The powerful high-performance engine roared to life, sending a thick, swirling cloud of white exhaust high into the freezing morning air. She rolled down the tinted window, waved at me with a bright, carefree smile, and then shifted the expensive vehicle into gear. As she pulled forward, expertly turning the heavy luxury SUV around in my wide, circular driveway, the rear of the vehicle came directly into my direct line of sight. My vision is remarkably sharp for a man of 70 years. I spent 4 grueling decades inspecting fine architectural details, checking microscopic structural welds, and reading incredibly complex municipal blueprints. My eyes naturally gravitate toward the smallest, most easily overlooked elements in any given environment. As the gleaming black Porsche smoothly accelerated toward the tall stone gates of my property, my gaze locked firmly onto the shiny silver license plate mounted securely on the rear bumper. More specifically, my eyes caught the thick, custom black metal frame, cleanly bordering the standard state-issued plate. Stamped boldly across the bottom edge of that dark metal frame, in crisp, unmistakable white block lettering, were 4 distinct, life-altering words: Kensington Holdings Corporate Fleet. I stood utterly frozen on the cold stone porch, the bitter winter wind biting harshly at my face as the glowing red taillights of the Porsche completely disappeared down the quiet, empty suburban street. The heavy silence of the morning rushed back in, but my racing mind was deafeningly loud. My daughter had just stood crying in my foyer, looked me dead in the eye, and desperately swore that her fiance had violently severed all financial and emotional ties with his toxic, controlling family. She had claimed they were retreating to a small rustic cabin in the woods to hide completely from the Kensington's wealthy, suffocating influence. Yet she was casually driving away from my home in a premium luxury vehicle officially registered to the very corporate empire Carter had supposedly walked away from in a fit of righteous anger. The incredibly jarring contradictions were certainly no longer just mildly suspicious to me now. They were glaring, undeniable proof of a massive, highly coordinated deception. Why was my daughter actively driving a corporate fleet vehicle owned by the exact same powerful people she claimed to despise and fear? The deeply touching illusion of the rustic micro-wedding dissolved almost instantly, leaving behind a shockingly cold, terrifying reality. My daughter was not protecting me from high society. She was deliberately protecting her high society life from me, and she was evidently using all of their immense wealth to do it. I stood frozen on this front porch for a long time after her car disappeared from view. The biting winter wind whipped against my face, but the physical cold was absolutely nothing compared to the freezing ache expanding deep inside my gut. The warmth of the illusion she had just spun in my foyer was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, undeniable dread. My own daughter had looked me dead in the eye and lied with the practiced ease of a seasoned con artist. I turned around and walked slowly back inside my home. The heavy oak door shut firmly behind me, sealing me inside the suffocating silence of the massive house. I unbuttoned my flannel shirt, feeling a sudden intense pressure building in my chest. It was a visceral, sickening sensation. It was the physical manifestation of a father, realizing that the person he loved most in the world viewed him as an adversary to be managed. I walked past the living room, completely ignoring the festive green garland that still lay abandoned on the hardwood floor. I simply did not want to look at it anymore. I did not want to think about Christmas or family or the holiday traditions that now felt like cruel jokes. I just wanted to do something normal, something mundane to ground myself in reality. I quickly decided to walk up the grand staircase to Morgan's childhood bedroom. She had spent an hour up there before coming down to perform her theatrical apology, supposedly packing up some old winter sweaters she needed for her rustic cabin getaway. I figured I would go in there, tidy up whatever mess she had left behind, and try to process the overwhelming wave of deception that had just crashed down upon my shoulders. The wooden steps creaked softly beneath my heavy boots as I made my way to the second floor. I pushed open the door to her bedroom and stepped inside. The room still looked exactly as it had when she left for her expensive university in New York. The walls were painted a soft, elegant lavender. The custom white furniture I had commissioned for her 16th birthday still gleamed perfectly in the morning light. It was a sanctuary built with my sweat and financed by my endless sacrifices. Yet standing in the middle of it now, I felt like a complete stranger trespassing in a luxury showroom. I scanned the room and noticed her half-empty ceramic coffee mug sitting casually on the edge of her pristine vanity table. A small ring of dark lipstick stained the rim. It was such a careless, dismissive gesture. She had treated my home like a brief rest stop, a convenient place to drop her emotional baggage, secure her alibi, and leave her trash for the help to clean up. I walked over to the vanity, picked up the ceramic mug, and let out a long, heavy sigh. I turned to carry it out to the hallway, fully intending to take it down to the kitchen sink and wash my hands of the entire morning. But as I turned, my gaze dropped naturally toward the small woven wicker wastebasket, tucked neatly beneath the edge of her writing desk. Something bright and stark white caught my attention against the dark interior of the bin. It was a single, heavily crumpled piece of thick paper. It looked completely out of place among the discarded makeup wipes and torn clothing tags she had tossed aside. I am a man who trusts his instincts. When something feels out of place, I investigate it thoroughly. I carefully set the coffee mug down on the edge of the desk and reached into the small wastebasket. My calloused fingers grasped the crumpled wad of paper. Instantly, I could feel the superior weight and distinct texture of the material. This was not a standard cheap piece of printer paper. It was heavy, expensive, high-stock parchment. It was the kind of premium paper used by high-end corporate law firms, elite banking institutions, and exclusive luxury vendors. I pulled it out of the bin and slowly began to smooth the deep creases against the flat, polished wooden surface of the desk. As the crumpled paper flattened out, the printed text and stark black lines slowly revealed themselves. I spent 30 grueling years of my life carefully reading highly complex architectural blueprints. I spent decades analyzing massive commercial budgets, calculating raw material costs, and balancing multi-million-dollar construction ledgers. My brain is uniquely wired to process numbers, contracts, and financial data almost automatically. I do not just read numbers. I instantly understand the entire narrative they are actively trying to construct. I flattened the top edge of the document and read the bold, elegant letterhead printed in shimmering gold ink. It was not a receipt for a rustic winter cabin rental in the remote upstate woods. It was an official, finalized invoice and deposit confirmation from the private events department of a world-renowned institution. My eyes scanned down the meticulously typed columns of the document. The venue listed on the invoice was the Plaza Hotel, located squarely in the heart of elite Manhattan. I read the line detailing the event date. It was for New Year's Eve, the exact same night Morgan claimed she was having a tiny, intimate ceremony in the freezing woods. I moved my finger down to the section detailing the logistics of the reservation. The confirmed guest count boldly printed on the invoice was not 20 close friends. It was 500 guests. 500 elite individuals formally invited to celebrate a massive, extravagant wedding gala in one of the most famous and expensive ballrooms in the entire world. My chest tightened as I moved my eyes to the final financial breakdown at the bottom of the page. The catering, the premium open bar, the custom floral arrangements, the live orchestral entertainment, and the ballroom rental fees were all meticulously itemized. The total cost for this single, luxurious evening of high society celebration was an absolutely staggering $500,000. I stared at the bold numbers, the sheer magnitude of the lie suffocating the air right out of my lungs. But the most devastating detail was not the location, the massive guest list, or even the astronomical price tag. The most horrifying piece of information was located at the very bottom right corner of the document. There, situated neatly on the designated line for the primary financial sponsor, was a sharp, confident signature executed in thick black ink. It was the signature authorizing a non-refundable deposit of $250,000 to secure the grand ballroom. I felt a sudden, intense wave of profound nausea wash over my entire body as I stared blankly at the cursive letters perfectly forming the undeniable identity of the secret event backer. I read the elegantly scrawled name aloud, my voice breaking the heavy, suffocating silence of the quiet bedroom. Patricia Kensington. My daughter had completely fabricated a story about a fake micro-wedding to hide a massive luxury gala entirely funded and controlled by her new mother-in-law. The name stared back at me from the crumpled parchment, mocking every single sacrifice I had ever made for my child. Patricia Kensington. The ink was thick and deliberate, the signature of a woman who was accustomed to buying whatever she desired. I dropped the heavy paper onto the vanity desk and slowly backed away, my chest heaving, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the lavender room. The physical sensation of this betrayal was not just a sharp ache. It was a deep, freezing hollow that radiated from my stomach to my fingertips. My daughter had looked me straight in the eyes just hours ago, crying pathetic tears, and told me she was fiercely protecting me from a toxic family. She had woven a tragic tale of a young couple retreating to a remote cabin to escape high society. It was all a meticulously rehearsed script. Every word was a deliberate calculation designed to keep me far away from her glittering Manhattan reality. I stood in the center of the room I had paid for, surrounded by the furniture I had bought, and felt a cold, mechanical detachment wash over my mind. The initial shock was rapidly fading, replaced by the relentless analytical focus that had allowed me to survive 40 years in the commercial construction industry. I needed to test the structural integrity of her lies. I needed to see exactly how far she was willing to go to maintain this absurd illusion. I reached into the pocket of my slacks and pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over Morgan's contact name. I took 3 deep, steadying breaths, forcing the immense fury bubbling in my throat to swallow itself. I had negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts with ruthless developers who smiled to my face while trying to bankrupt me. I knew exactly how to keep my tone perfectly level. I pressed the call button and raised the phone to my ear. It rang twice before she answered. Her voice was bright, entirely devoid of the heavy sorrow she had projected in my foyer earlier that morning. She greeted me with a cheerful tone, asking if I was already missing her. I forced a soft, paternal chuckle, a sound that felt like sandpaper scraping against my throat. I told her that of course I missed her, but that I was calling because I had a sudden idea. I explained that since I could not be there to walk her down the aisle or celebrate with her on New Year's Eve, I wanted to do something special to mark the occasion. I told her I wanted to send a premium case of vintage champagne and an extravagant gourmet gift basket directly to the remote cabin where they were hosting their tiny rustic micro-wedding. The bright, cheerful energy on the other end of the line evaporated instantly. A thick, awkward silence stretched between us, filled only by the faint sound of Manhattan traffic bleeding through her end of the connection. I waited patiently, letting the heavy pause perform its intended work. When she finally spoke, her voice was noticeably tighter, the pitch slightly higher than normal. She stammered, telling me that it was an incredibly sweet gesture, but completely unnecessary. I pressed the issue, keeping my tone exceptionally warm and aggressively supportive. I insisted that it was the absolute least I could do for my only daughter on her wedding day. I simply asked her to provide the exact address of the rental cabin so I could coordinate the delivery with a private courier service. The panic in her breathing was audible now. She began to audibly scramble her mind, racing to construct a barricade for the sudden trap I had set. She told me the cabin was located in an incredibly remote, off-the-grid town in upstate New York. She quickly manufactured a name, calling it Pine Haven Ridge, claiming it was so incredibly isolated that traditional courier services would absolutely never be able to navigate the treacherous winter roads. She insisted that cell service was non-existent and that receiving a delivery would be a massive logistical nightmare. I listened to her weave this pathetic, desperate fiction, my heart growing colder by the second. I smoothly accepted her excuse, telling her I certainly did not want to cause any undue stress on her special weekend. I let out a soft sigh, effortlessly pivoting the conversation away from the wedding to lower her defenses. I casually changed the subject, adopting the tone of a curious, practical father. I mentioned her unexpected visit that morning and smoothly brought up the brand-new Porsche Macan she had parked in my driveway. I told her it was an absolutely beautiful piece of machinery, but I admitted I was slightly concerned about her financial stability. I gently asked her how she and Carter were managing such a massive automotive expense, especially considering they were supposedly completely cut off from the vast Kensington family fortune. The second trap snapped shut. Morgan did not miss a beat, her lying now, a smooth, reflexive habit. She let out a dismissive little laugh, assuring me that I had absolutely nothing to worry about. She claimed the luxury vehicle was actually a deeply discounted pre-owned bargain she had miraculously found at a wholesale dealership in New Jersey. She explicitly stated that she had purchased the car entirely on her own, using the careful savings she had accumulated over the past 3 years. She spun a story about negotiating fiercely with the salesman to secure a monthly payment she could comfortably afford on her modest fashion industry salary. I listened to her articulate this detailed financial fantasy perfectly, picturing the heavy black leather key fob stamped with the Kensington Holdings logo. She was blatantly lying to my face, doubling down on her deceit with a level of cold, sociopathic ease that genuinely terrified me. I told her I was incredibly proud of her financial independence, praising her for being such a highly responsible adult. I wished her a wonderful day and ended the call. I slowly lowered the phone, the silence of the lavish bedroom crashing back down around me. The lingering doubts were permanently eradicated. My only daughter was a pathological liar. The tragic story of the estranged, toxic family was an absolute fabrication. The secluded rustic micro-wedding in the snowy woods was a complete, desperate myth. The stark reality was written in bold ink on the Plaza Hotel invoice resting on the desk. The grand $500,000 wedding was absolutely undeniably happening. The wealthy, aristocratic Kensingtons were proudly hosting it. My daughter was marrying into high society just as she had always dreamed, surrounded by 500 elite guests in the heart of Manhattan. And I, the hard-working man who had funded her entire existence from the day she was born, was the only person being deliberately, systematically excluded from the celebration. The jagged pieces of the puzzle were now fully assembled, revealing a clear picture of staggering cruelty and deep betrayal. I was shut out. But the most important question still remained unanswered, burning wildly in my chest. Why? The question of why echoed in my mind like a physical blow. I could not just stand there in the biting cold any longer. I am not a man who waits passively for the storm to hit. I am the man who secures the foundation before the rain even begins to fall. I turned my back on the empty driveway and walked purposefully back inside my sprawling stone colonial. The grand house felt entirely different now. It was no longer a warm monument to my family, but a cold crime scene waiting to be processed. I headed straight down the main hallway toward my private study. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside the only room that still felt completely mine. I sat down heavily in my worn leather chair, the familiar material creaking softly under my weight. I placed my calloused hands flat on the polished surface of my desk. I needed facts. I needed cold, hard data. The time for blind, unconditional trust had officially passed. Every single thing my daughter had told me over the last few months was now entirely suspect. I absolutely had to uncover the actual truth. If Morgan was willing to construct such a massive, elaborate lie about a rustic micro-wedding and a used car, she was clearly hiding something far more substantial than mere social embarrassment. I absolutely refused to be a passive victim in my own life. I had built an empire from the ground up, and I would not let it be dismantled by deceit. I opened the top drawer of my heavy desk and pulled out my secure corporate laptop. As the machine booted up the screen glowing brightly in the dim room, my mind drifted back to the day I established Morgan's trust fund. It was shortly after Diane had passed away. I was consumed by a profound, suffocating grief, but my primary instinct was to protect our only child from the harsh realities of the world. I had sat in a sleek downtown law office and signed away millions of dollars into an irrevocable trust. It was explicitly designed to ensure that no matter what happened to my commercial construction business, Morgan would never experience a single day of financial hardship. I had structured the account meticulously. The principal balance was locked tight, heavily guarded by strict stipulations, but the interest generated was more than enough to fund a highly luxurious lifestyle. I had given her the golden key to an easy life, fully trusting her to honor the incredible sacrifice it took to build that wealth. Now, as I typed in my complex passwords and authenticated my identity through the bank's secure digital portal, that generous trust felt like a terrible, blinding mistake. I needed to see exactly what she was doing with my money, because her fabricated stories were rapidly falling apart under basic scrutiny. The banking dashboard materialized on the bright screen. I bypassed my personal checking accounts and my massive corporate operating funds, navigating directly to the wealth management sector. I clicked on the specific portfolio holding Morgan's trust. At first glance, everything appeared entirely normal. The massive principal balance was completely intact, sitting exactly where it was supposed to be. The monthly interest disbursements were flowing steadily into her private checking account, providing the generous allowance I had never once questioned. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow, shaking breath. For a brief, incredibly foolish second, I thought perhaps I was overreacting. Perhaps her lies truly were just the pathetic, desperate actions of an insecure young woman trying desperately to impress her wealthy new in-laws. Perhaps she really was just terrified of them judging my rough hands and my simple working-class demeanor. But my instincts, honed by decades of finding the hidden fatal flaws in massive architectural blueprints, simply refused to let me close the laptop. When the surface looks too perfect, there is usually rot hiding deep in the supporting beams. I leaned forward again and opened the detailed transaction history. I did not just look at the cleared funds. I navigated straight to the back-end administrative tab, the restricted section detailing institutional alerts and secure internal communications regarding the account. My eyes scanned the digital log of banking activity over the past 90 days. Buried deep beneath the routine monthly transfers and automated tax document notifications, a single bright red, flagged alert jumped out at me. The notification was dated exactly 2 weeks ago. I clicked on the digital file, opening a comprehensive communication from the Senior Wealth Management Director assigned to our accounts. I read the formal banking language, my blood turning to absolute ice in my veins. The document detailed a formal, highly aggressive request, initiated by Morgan and a secondary legal representative whose name I did not recognize. They had attempted to leverage the entire locked principal balance of her trust fund as collateral for a massive commercial line of credit. I read the numbers again, my vision blurring slightly at the sheer magnitude of their incredible audacity. They were attempting to secure an astronomical $8 million in liquid capital. The bank had flagged the transaction as highly suspicious and outright denied the request, specifically citing the strict protective clauses I had personally mandated when the trust was originally established. The internal notes indicated that Morgan had argued fiercely with the bank managers, demanding immediate access to the leverage, aggressively claiming it was for a vital, time-sensitive investment opportunity that could not wait for my manual approval. I sat in the suffocating silence of my dark mahogany study, reading the denied request over and over again. The crushing reality of the situation hit me with the devastating force of a swinging wrecking ball. Morgan was not just excluding me from her extravagant Plaza Hotel wedding because she was embarrassed by my calloused hands or my proud blue-collar background. This profound deception was not about social anxiety or managing high society expectations. This was purely, coldly financial. She had driven to my house this morning, cried fake tears, and begged me to stay away, all while secretly plotting to mortgage her entire future for a massive payout. A massive, calculated trap was being set behind my back, and I was standing right on the trap door. The Kensingtons were not just hosting a grand wedding. They were orchestrating a massive financial extraction. My daughter had completely sold her soul to them, and they were actively trying to drain the empire I had built with my bare hands. I closed the laptop, a new incredibly dangerous calm settling over my mind. They thought I was just a clueless old man they could easily discard without a second thought. They believed my parental love would make me a blind, compliant victim. They were fundamentally wrong. They had awakened fierce protective instincts I usually reserved for aggressive corporate negotiations. They were about to learn exactly how I built my fortune from nothing, and why men in my brutal industry absolutely never walk onto a hostile job site without a devastating, perfectly executed contingency plan to level the playing field. I sat in the heavy silence of my study, the glowing screen of the laptop casting long shadows across the mahogany desk. The overwhelming urge to pick up the phone to scream at my daughter, to demand an immediate explanation for her staggering betrayal, burned fiercely in my chest. It is the natural instinct of a father to confront his child when they stray from the path. But I forced that instinct down, burying it beneath 4 decades of brutal commercial construction experience. Confrontation is a rookie mistake. Confrontation merely gives your enemy precious time to adapt, to fabricate new excuses, to cover their tracks, and to fortify their defenses. If I called Morgan now, she would simply invent another plausible lie. She would claim the trust fund inquiry was a simple misunderstanding or a minor administrative error orchestrated by an overzealous bank manager. I needed absolute leverage, and you do not gain leverage by announcing your suspicions. You gain leverage by remaining completely silent while you quietly dismantle their foundation. I closed the laptop with a decisive, sharp click. The time for parental indulgence was permanently over. The Kensingtons had chosen to target my family, my money, and my life's work. They had weaponized my daughter against me. I needed a professional who understood how to navigate the darkest, most complicated financial labyrinths without leaving a single footprint behind. I reached for my cell phone and pulled up a contact I had not needed to use in over 5 years. I scrolled down to the name Derek Shaw and pressed the call button. Derek was not a typical private investigator. He did not waste time taking grainy photographs of cheating spouses or tracking down runaway teenagers. He was a ruthless, highly intelligent former forensic accountant who had traded his corporate cubicle for the lucrative world of high-stakes corporate espionage. I used him exclusively to vet sketchy subcontractors, untangle complex offshore holding companies, and dig up the buried financial skeletons of rival developers who tried to undercut my bids. He was notoriously expensive, entirely devoid of moral hesitation, and frighteningly efficient. The line rang 3 times before his gruff, gravelly voice answered. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed his specific skill set immediately, and that cost was absolutely no object. I gave him the address of a rundown, obscure 24-hour diner located on the industrial outskirts of Philadelphia, a place where no one from my normal social circles would ever accidentally spot me. I told him to meet me there in exactly 1 hour. I grabbed my thick wool coat, locked my study, and walked out into the freezing winter afternoon. The drive to the diner was a blur of gray skies and bare trees. My mind was racing, calculating every single possible angle of this massive deception. When I finally pulled into the cracked, pothole-ridden parking lot, I saw Derek sitting in a nondescript black sedan. We walked into the diner separately, taking a sticky vinyl booth in the far back corner, far away from the large, grease-stained windows. The air smelled of stale coffee and burnt bacon. Derek sat across from me, his sharp, calculating eyes tracking my every movement as I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy coat. I did not bother ordering anything from the tired waitress, who briefly approached our table. I pulled out a thick manila envelope and placed it firmly onto the scratched laminate surface between us. I pushed the envelope across the table. Derek opened the flap and carefully slid the contents onto the table. I watched him examine the heavily crumpled high-stock parchment paper I had recovered from Morgan's trash can. His eyes scanned the luxurious golden letterhead, the massive guest count, and the astronomical $500,000 price tag. I pointed a thick finger directly at the bottom right corner of the document, specifically highlighting the dark, confident signature of Patricia Kensington. Then I handed him a small, folded piece of paper containing the exact license plate number of the sleek black Porsche Macan my daughter was currently driving, explicitly noting the corporate fleet registration. Finally, I placed a printed copy of the secure banking alert on the table detailing the highly aggressive, unauthorized attempt to leverage Morgan's $8 million trust fund for a commercial line of credit. Derek looked at the documents, his expression entirely unreadable. I leaned across the sticky table, my voice dropping to a harsh, demanding whisper. I told him that the people listed on those documents were presenting themselves as wealthy, untouchable pillars of elite Manhattan society. I told him they were currently orchestrating a massive, highly exclusive wedding for my daughter at the Plaza Hotel, while simultaneously convincing her to lie to my face and systematically drain my financial resources. I needed to know exactly why. I gave Derek his explicit directive. I told him to tear the entire Kensington family financial history apart. I wanted him to trace every single corporate holding, every hidden offshore bank account, every shell company, and every outstanding debt. I wanted to know if they truly possessed the vast generational wealth they aggressively projected, or if it was all an elaborate hollow facade constructed to trap a naive young woman and her wealthy father. I wanted the absolute unvarnished truth, no matter how deeply it was buried beneath their polished public image. Derek gathered the documents, sliding them smoothly back into the manila envelope. He looked at me, a grim, knowing smile briefly touching the corners of his mouth. He told me he would have a preliminary dossier ready for me by the following evening. He slid out of the booth and walked out into the freezing wind, leaving me alone in the dim, empty diner to wait. The next 24 hours were an agonizing exercise in psychological endurance. I paced the empty, echoing halls of my sprawling stone house, the suffocating silence amplifying the terrible anxiety burning in my gut. I forced myself to ignore the festive holiday decorations, the framed family photographs, and the constant painful memories of Morgan's childhood. Every time my cell phone vibrated, my pulse spiked fully, expecting another fabricated story from my daughter. Instead, I sat in my dark study staring blankly at the wall, waiting for the professional I had unleashed to finally tear down the curtain. The sun had long since set, plunging the cold winter evening into absolute darkness, when my secure mobile phone finally rang. The caller identification displayed a restricted number. I snatched the phone from the heavy mahogany desk and pressed it against my ear. I did not offer a greeting. I simply listened to the sharp, static hiss of the encrypted line. Derek did not waste a second with pleasantries. His gravelly voice was tight, urgent, and entirely devoid of his usual detached professional calm. The words he spoke sent a massive physical jolt of pure adrenaline coursing straight through my veins. "Harrison, you need to get to New York immediately. The Kensingtons are hosting a pre-wedding charity gala tonight. You need to see this with your own eyes." The line went dead before I could even ask a single question. Derek had hung up, leaving me standing in the center of my dark study with the chilling command echoing in my ears. I did not hesitate. I did not waste time packing a bag or overthinking the logistics of a sudden trip to Manhattan. I simply walked over to my bedroom closet and pulled out my standard, perfectly tailored charcoal gray business suit. It was the exact same suit I wore when negotiating brutal municipal contracts or facing down aggressive corporate developers. I actively chose not to wear a tuxedo. I knew perfectly well that a high society charity gala in New York City would strictly demand black tie attire, but I had zero intention of conforming to their rigid elitist expectations. This dark wool suit was the hard-earned armor of a self-made man. It was a stark, uncompromising reminder of exactly who I was and how I had built my empire. I buttoned my crisp white shirt, adjusted my simple silk tie, and walked out the front door. The drive up the New Jersey Turnpike was a blur of flashing headlights and dark winter asphalt. My mind was completely hyper-focused on the task at hand. I was operating purely on adrenaline and cold, calculated rage. While navigating the heavy evening traffic, I used my car's hands-free system to make a few highly discreet phone calls. Through a trusted corporate broker I occasionally used for securing last-minute luxury accommodations, for high-level clients I managed to purchase a scalped ticket to the Kensington Charity Gala. It cost an absolutely exorbitant amount of money, but I did not care. I registered the premium VIP ticket under a completely fake corporate entity, ensuring my real name would never appear on the official guest manifest at the front door. I was going to walk straight into their glittering fortress, completely undetected. I parked my vehicle in a secure underground garage several blocks away from the venue and walked the rest of the distance through the freezing Manhattan wind. The gala was being held at a historic, incredibly exclusive private club just off Fifth Avenue. A massive line of black town cars and luxury limousines stretched down the entire block. Photographers and society reporters clustered near the entrance, snapping flashing pictures of women draped in diamonds and men wearing identical stiff tuxedos. I bypassed the main red carpet, completely opting for the secondary corporate entrance designated for high-tier donors. The polished security guards at the door barely gave my charcoal suit a second glance once the digital scanner validated my heavily overpriced VIP ticket. The heavy brass doors swung open, and I stepped smoothly into the belly of the beast. The sheer level of ostentatious wealth inside the building was almost suffocating. I slipped quietly into the grand ballroom and immediately melted into the dark shadows near the heavily draped windows. I stood completely still, a silent, unseen ghost observing a world my daughter had desperately lied to enter. The massive room was a blinding sea of gilded gold walls, enormous crystal chandeliers, and towering, precariously stacked pyramids of expensive vintage champagne. Waiters in pristine white coats glided silently through the dense crowd, offering tiny, intricate appetizers on polished silver trays. The air was thick with the overwhelming scent of expensive perfume and the loud, overlapping hum of meaningless, superficial networking. I leaned back against the cool plaster wall, keeping my face partially obscured by the thick velvet curtains. As I watched the wealthy elite laugh and drink, a powerful, grounding memory unexpectedly washed over my mind. I looked up at the intricate, soaring ceiling above the crystal chandeliers. 40 years ago, when I was just a young, exhausted contractor, desperate to feed my growing family, I had spent months crawling through the tight, suffocating ceilings of magnificent buildings exactly like this one. I remembered the intense, aching heat of the welding torches. I remembered the heavy metallic smell of fresh aluminum and the thick coating of gray dust that settled permanently into the deep lines of my hands. I had laid the actual complex HVAC ductwork that kept these massive, opulent rooms perfectly cooled for these wealthy socialites. I had bled and sweated in the dark, hidden spaces so that these people could dance comfortably in the light. And now, my own daughter was deeply ashamed of the very hands that had built the foundation of her entire life. She looked down on the honest, grueling labor that had paid for her expensive education and funded her entrance into this glittering, hollow room. I tightened my grip on the edge of the velvet curtain, pushing the painful memories aside to focus sharply on the present moment. I began to slowly, methodically scan the dense, swirling crowd. I looked past the prominent politicians, the aging hedge fund managers, and the shallow socialites. I was hunting for a specific target. Derek had told me I needed to see this with my own eyes, and I was not going to leave until I found out exactly what he meant. I moved quietly along the perimeter of the grand ballroom, keeping my dark suit blended perfectly into the shadows of the tall marble columns. Then, near the very center of the room, standing directly beneath the largest and brightest crystal chandelier, I finally spotted them. Richard and Patricia Kensington. They looked exactly like the glossy Society magazine profiles Morgan had sent me. Richard was tall and distinguished, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo with an effortless, arrogant grace. Patricia stood rigidly beside him, dripping in heavy diamonds, her face pulled into a tight, practiced, aristocratic smile. They were completely surrounded by a large group of admiring guests, clearly holding court as the undisputed king and queen of the evening. They looked incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy, and incredibly comfortable in their absolute dominance of the room. But it was not the commanding presence of the Kensingtons that made the blood run completely cold in my veins. It was not their arrogant smiles or their blinding jewelry that caused the sudden violent ringing in my ears. It was the people standing directly beside them. Positioned perfectly to Richard Kensington's right, laughing warmly at a joke the older man had just made, was Carter. And standing immediately next to him, with her arm looped tightly and affectionately through Carter's elbow, was Morgan. My daughter was wearing a stunning floor-length emerald gown that clung perfectly to her frame. Her hair was professionally styled, and a delicate diamond necklace glittered brightly against her collarbone. She looked absolutely radiant. She leaned forward, placing a gentle, familiar hand on Patricia Kensington's arm as they shared a close, intimate laugh. The four of them stood closely together, a flawless portrait of absolute unity. They were taking professional photographs, smiling brightly for the society cameras, toasting champagne glasses, and introducing each other to passing dignitaries. There was no shouting match. There was no bitter family-shattering estrangement. There was no brave, dramatic stand against a toxic, controlling dynasty. There was no rustic, remote micro-wedding being planned in a freezing upstate cabin to escape their horrible influence. It was a breathtakingly complete, flawless picture of a perfectly united, deeply loving family. They were happily celebrating the upcoming grand wedding together. The truth slammed into my chest with the brutal, unstoppable force of a freight train. My daughter had not been forced out of this family. She had been completely joyfully absorbed into it. The only person in the entire world who was actually being deliberately, systematically excluded from this beautiful union was me. I stood perfectly still in the dark shadows of the ballroom, watching my only child smile warmly at the woman who had signed the Plaza Hotel invoice, entirely unaware that the clueless old man she had discarded was currently standing less than 50 feet away. The crushing weight of the revelation settled into my bones, freezing the initial surge of panic into a solid knot of absolute anger. I remained perfectly still within the velvet curtains, watching the glittering scene unfold just 50 feet away. My daughter, the girl I carried on my shoulders and worked double shifts to protect, threw her head back and let out a bright laugh. It was a genuine sound that stood in sharp contrast to the desperate sobs she faked in my foyer just hours prior. The emerald fabric of her designer gown caught the light of the crystal chandeliers above, highlighting the effortless way she leaned into Patricia Kensington. They looked like lifelong friends bonded by immense wealth and shared secrets. There was no tension, no awkwardness, and no bitter estrangement. The elaborate narrative Morgan spun about a brave couple fighting high society monsters was a complete calculated illusion. The reality stood right in front of me, sipping champagne and posing for photographers. The Kensingtons were not my daughter's tormentors. They were her enthusiastic co-conspirators. They had welcomed her into their gilded fortress with open arms, and together they had firmly locked the iron gates against the working-class father who had paid the toll. The profound betrayal did not break my spirit. Instead, it hardened my resolve into something dangerous and unforgiving. I refused to let this charade continue. I needed to know exactly what they were planning behind my back. I reached my right hand into the inner pocket of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. My rough fingers brushed against the smooth surface of a tiny plastic casing. Derek Shaw had anticipated my need for concrete intelligence. The ruthless investigator had slid this small object across the sticky table, explaining its capabilities with detached professional precision. It was a military-grade, long-range, microscopic audio transmitter. Derek utilized these highly restricted devices to silently monitor corrupt boardrooms and gather devastating leverage against fraudulent corporate executives. The primary bug was no larger than a standard shirt button coated in a matte adhesive designed to stick firmly to any flat surface. The accompanying receiver was currently locked safely inside the glove compartment of my truck. I ran my thumb over the tiny microphone, mentally preparing myself for the tremendous risk I was about to take. If I was caught planting a surveillance device at a high-profile charity gala, the ensuing legal scandal would instantly destroy my company and my reputation. But the desperate need to uncover the absolute truth far outweighed the terrible risk of discovery. I pulled my hand from my pocket, keeping the microscopic transmitter securely hidden within the palm of my right hand. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the chaotic, overlapping noise of the grand ballroom wash over my senses. I needed a distraction. I needed a perfectly timed opening to breach their inner circle without drawing a single suspicious glance. My construction background had taught me how to read the complex, dynamic flow of any active environment. I narrowed my eyes, meticulously analyzing the constant swirling movement of the wealthy guests and the hired catering staff. Double doors to my left swung open, and a coordinated line of waiters emerged, carrying massive silver trays loaded with elaborate culinary creations. They moved in a swift, practiced formation, cutting a direct path through the dense crowd straight toward the central V1P area, where the Kensingtons were proudly holding court. This was my singular window of opportunity. I stepped smoothly out from the dark shadows of the velvet curtains and seamlessly merged into the chaotic, bustling perimeter of the catering procession. I kept my head slightly bowed, utilizing the broad shoulders of a tall waiter in front of me as a physical shield. We rapidly approached the massive circular main table where Richard, Patricia Carter, and Morgan were currently seated. My heart hammered against my ribs with the violent force of a pneumatic drill. I was close enough to smell the rich floral notes of my daughter's expensive perfume. I was close enough to hear the distinct clinking of their crystal champagne flutes. As the waiters descended upon the table to serve the lavish appetizers, The surrounding guests naturally shifted and jostled for position. I seized the chaotic moment. I deliberately caught the reinforced toe of my leather dress shoe against the thick, ornate edge of a heavy dining chair. I let out a sharp, surprised gasp, feigning a sudden, clumsy stumble. I pitched my upper body forward, allowing my left hand to slap loudly against the polished mahogany surface of their table to break my awkward fall. Simultaneously, under the cover of my dramatic movement, I dropped my white linen napkin. As it fluttered toward the patterned carpet, my right hand darted swiftly beneath the overhanging edge of the main table. With a single press of my thumb, I firmly stuck the microscopic audio bug directly onto the hidden wooden underbelly. The adhesive gripped instantly. I snatched the fallen napkin from the floor and quickly straightened my posture, offering a rapid apologetic bow to the startled guests nearby. I mumbled a generic excuse about losing my footing. Neither Richard nor Patricia Kensington paid me any real attention, turning their aristocratic noses away from the anonymous man in the charcoal suit. More importantly, Morgan did not glance in my direction. Her attention was entirely captivated by a politician standing opposite her. I did not linger. I turned my back on my daughter and walked away. I navigated the dense crowd with absolute precision, suppressing the primal urge to scream her name. I pushed through the heavy brass doors of the grand ballroom, marched across the expansive marble lobby, and bypassed the security guards. I pushed out into the freezing Manhattan night. The mission was successfully completed. I pulled the collar of my wool coat tight against my neck and walked rapidly down the dark, icy sidewalks. I did not stop until I reached the dimly lit parking garage. I found my truck parked in the deep shadows of the lower level, a rugged contrast to the sleek luxury sedans surrounding it. I unlocked the heavy door, climbed into the freezing driver's side cabin, and slammed the door shut instantly, sealing myself inside the quiet space. I reached directly into the center console and retrieved the small rectangular audio receiver Derek had provided. The metal casing was cold against my fingertips. I plugged a black earpiece into the designated side port and secured it firmly inside my ear. I took one shuddering breath, staring blankly out through the frosted windshield into the empty concrete alleyway. My thumb hovered over the small power switch located on the side of the receiver. This was the point of no return. Whatever I was about to hear would permanently alter the entire landscape of my life. I pressed the button. A sharp burst of electronic static instantly flooded my ear. The advanced military hardware quickly stabilized, locking onto the microscopic transmitter I had hidden beneath the mahogany table. The static abruptly cleared. Rising sharply above the ambient background noise, the distinct voices of my daughter and her new family streamed directly into my ear. The sharp hiss of electronic static faded into a crystal-clear stream of audio directly inside my right ear. The microscopic military-grade transmitter performed flawlessly, picking up the rich ambient acoustics of the grand ballroom with terrifying precision. I sat perfectly still in the freezing cabin of my truck, the dark Manhattan alleyway, completely empty around me. Through the tiny earpiece, I could hear the delicate clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the low, sophisticated murmur of high society networking. Then cutting through the background noise with sickening clarity came the bright melodic sound of my daughter laughing. It was a joyful, unburdened sound, entirely free of the manufactured anxiety she had weaponized against me in my own foyer just 12 hours earlier. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the cold leather headrest, and listened to the people who had stolen my only child. The initial conversation was a masterclass in aristocratic banter. Richard Kensington was recounting a recent sailing trip to the French Riviera, his deep voice dripping with casual arrogance. He complained about the inadequate docking facilities in Monaco and the terrible vintage of wine they had been served at a Michelin-starred restaurant. Patricia chimed in, her tone laced with practiced boredom, discussing her upcoming winter trip to a private ski chalet in the Swiss Alps. I listened to them casually discard sums of money that would take a working-class family a decade to earn. And right there, seamlessly integrated into their elite dialogue, was Morgan. She did not sound like the grounded, humble girl I had raised. She sounded like a carbon copy of Patricia. My daughter enthusiastically agreed with their shallow complaints, actively contributing her own fabricated stories about luxury fashion boutiques and exclusive private clubs she had supposedly frequented for years. She was effortlessly speaking their language, eagerly participating in their snobbish judgments of people who did not possess their level of generational wealth. I breathed slowly, the cold anger settling deep into the very center of my chest. It was one thing to know my daughter had lied to me. It was another thing entirely to sit in the freezing darkness and listen to her gleefully reject the very foundation of her upbringing. I had spent 40 years breathing in concrete dust and braving sub-zero temperatures on commercial construction sites to ensure she never wanted for a single thing. I had paid for her elite education, hoping it would give her an undeniable advantage in the real world. Instead, that expensive education had merely taught her how to expertly mimic the worst, most superficial traits of the ultra-wealthy. She was eagerly discarding her true identity to fit perfectly into a mold crafted by the Kensingtons. The ambient noise of the ballroom swelled slightly as a string quartet began to play a soft classical melody in the background. The conversation at the main VIP table naturally shifted away from European vacations and pivoted directly toward the upcoming weekend. Patricia Kensington's voice took on a sharp, commanding edge as she began reviewing the final logistical details for the wedding. She spoke excitedly about the massive floral installations being imported directly from Holland and the custom silk table linens she had personally selected for the grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel. I listened to her casually boast about the 500 elite guests who had formally RSVP'd a guest list that apparently included local politicians, prominent Wall Street executives, and international dignitaries. Morgan responded with a flawless performance of profound gratitude. She thanked Patricia profusely, her voice overflowing with a sickeningly sweet tone, telling the older woman that she could never have planned such a magical evening without her incredible taste and boundless generosity. My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. Morgan was actively praising the very woman she had just sworn was a toxic, narcissistic monster. She was lovingly thanking the family she had claimed was trying to destroy her life. The absolute ease with which she navigated these two completely contradictory realities was deeply disturbing. It was a level of cold, calculating deception that went far beyond simple social embarrassment. She was operating like a highly trained covert operative, seamlessly feeding me one tragic narrative while living a glittering, luxurious fantasy in Manhattan. The string quartet finished their piece, and a brief lull fell over the VIP table. The clinking of silverware and the soft murmur of the crowd filled the temporary silence. Then Patricia Kensington spoke again. Her voice shifted from the commanding tone of a society hostess to something remarkably softer, laced with a cloying, performative sympathy. The words she spoke next froze the very blood in my veins. "Darling, how is your poor father doing? Is the memory care facility keeping him comfortable?" The question hung in the air, transmitted through the earpiece with devastating clarity. I stopped breathing. The quiet hum of the truck engine seemed to vanish entirely. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The leather creaked under the immense crushing pressure of my hands. My mind violently rejected the words I had just heard. A memory care facility. My brain, perfectly sharp and relentlessly analytical, struggled to process the sheer audacity of the premise. I was a man who still actively managed complex commercial construction portfolios. I read complicated legal contracts for a living. Yet in the glittering reality my daughter had constructed for her new family, I was a tragic, broken invalid locked away in a medical institution. I waited for Morgan to respond. A tiny, foolish fragment of my heart hoping she would correct the older woman. I hoped she would pull back from this horrifying narrative. But the silence stretched only for a second before Morgan answered. She let out a long, heavy, perfectly executed tragic sigh. It was a sound of profound emotional exhaustion, the kind of sigh produced by a devoted daughter, carrying an unbearable burden of sorrow. "His Alzheimer's is so severe now, Patricia. He doesn't even know his own name anymore. The doctors say it's best he stays in the facility. It breaks my heart that he can't walk me down the aisle. The words slammed into my chest like a physical strike. I closed my eyes, the darkness of the alleyway mirroring the sudden, absolute darkness expanding within my soul. She did not merely exclude me because she was embarrassed by my calloused hands, my rough boots, or my proud blue-collar background. She had not simply pushed me aside to avoid awkward social introductions. The truth was infinitely more sinister and infinitely more permanent. I sat quietly inside the freezing cabin of the truck, listening to them murmur their gentle, hollow sympathies. They praised her incredible strength, commending her for making the heartbreaking decision to place her beloved father in professional medical care. They were comforting a phantom sorrow, totally oblivious to the absolute fact that the man they were discussing was sitting right outside in full possession of his mental faculties, listening to every single poisonous word. By declaring me completely lost to dementia, she had socially neutralized me. She had finally and medically erased me. The freezing air inside the cabin of my truck felt thick and unbreathable. I sat in the complete darkness of the Manhattan alleyway, the tiny earpiece acting as a direct conduit into a nightmare I could never have imagined. My daughter had just casually, effortlessly diagnosed me with severe Alzheimer's disease to a table of Manhattan elite. She had medically erased my existence to generate sympathy and conveniently explain my absence from the most important day of her life. My mind raced trying to process the staggering cruelty of her words. I was a man who actively ran a highly complex, multi-million-dollar commercial construction empire. I managed massive payrolls, negotiated intricate union contracts, and visualized complex architectural blueprints with absolute clarity. Yet in the glittering, superficial reality my daughter had constructed to protect her fragile social standing, I was a tragic invalid locked away in a memory care facility, unable to remember my own name. The sheer calculating deception required to weave such a lie was breathtaking. I spent 40 years building a foundation of absolute stability for Morgan, and she used it to build a stage for a grotesque fictional tragedy. Before I could fully digest the magnitude of this medical fabrication, a new voice cut through the ambient noise of the grand ballroom. It was Carter, her handsome, aristocratic fiance. He let out a smooth, confident, and entirely humorless laugh. The sound grated against my ears, dripping with casual arrogance. He gently tapped his crystal champagne flute against the table, drawing the attention of his parents. His voice was bright and reassuring, designed to soothe any lingering anxieties about their carefully crafted social image. "Don't worry, Mother," Carter said smoothly, his tone perfectly matching the elite atmosphere of the room. "I've handled the optics. I hired a veteran Broadway actor to play Morgan's father for the rehearsal dinner. He looks extremely distinguished, he knows his fine wines, and he certainly won't embarrass us by talking about pouring concrete or hauling steel beams." The words washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. My chest tightened until it felt as though my ribs were slowly cracking under an immense invisible weight. I closed my eyes and gripped the leather steering wheel of my truck, my calloused fingers digging into the material with white-knuckled intensity. They were not merely excluding me from the celebration. They were literally hiring an actor to play a better, richer, socially acceptable version of me. They were bringing in a tailored, polished mannequin to shake hands, sip vintage champagne, and play the role of the wealthy, sophisticated patriarch. They needed a father figure to present to their elite high society friends, but they simply could not stomach the reality of the man who had actually funded the entire spectacle. My rough working-class hands and unpolished demeanor were considered a terminal liability. I was a structural defect in their perfect aesthetic, so they had contracted a professional to paper over the cracks. I listened as Patricia Kensington let out a soft, delighted sigh of profound relief. She praised her son for his brilliant, proactive problem-solving, commending him for ensuring that their prestigious social circle would remain entirely oblivious to Morgan's unfortunate blue-collar pedigree. Morgan chimed in, laughing warmly, expressing her deep gratitude to Carter for saving her from the terrible anxiety of managing my inevitably awkward behavior. She spoke about me as if I were a wild, unpredictable animal that needed to be kept far away from their aristocratic lives. The casual, effortless way they dismissed my humanity was staggering. They had stripped me of my identity, my pride and my dignity, replacing me with a hired performer who could properly pronounce the names of French vineyards. I sat in the darkness, the cold anger solidifying into a hard, indestructible diamond of absolute resolve. But the conversation transmitting through the hidden audio bug did not stop at shallow vanity. I kept the earpiece pressed firmly against my ear, listening intently as the topic slowly drifted away from the rehearsal dinner logistics. The string quartet in the background transitioned into a slower, more dramatic movement, masking the slight drop in Richard Kensington's booming voice. The patriarch of the family leaned forward, his tone shifting abruptly from the casual arrogance of a society host to the sharp, calculating cadence of a ruthless businessman. The frivolous chatter about floral arrangements and hired actors evaporated instantly. "The optics of the dinner are fine, Carter," Richard said, his voice low and intensely serious. "But we have a much more pressing timeline regarding the primary capital. Have you resolved the liquidity issue with Morgan's Trust?" The air in the cabin of my truck seemed to grow even colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The superficial vanity project was suddenly shifting into a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy. Carter cleared his throat, the confident arrogance bleeding out of his voice replaced by a tense defensive edge. "We hit a minor administrative wall, Father." The wealth management director at the primary bank flagged the transaction. Morgan's father was incredibly paranoid when he established the trust. The principal balance is locked behind a secondary authorization clause. The bank explicitly denied the $8 million commercial line of credit because it requires his direct notarized signature to leverage the core assets. We tried to bypass it, but the institutional safeguards are annoyingly rigid. "A minor administrative wall," Richard hissed, his voice tight with barely suppressed fury. "We have leveraged the family holdings to secure the real estate development in Dubai, based on the explicit guarantee of those $8 million. Our primary creditors are demanding the collateral transfer by Monday morning. If that credit line is not fully approved and instantly liquidated into our offshore holding accounts, the entire development completely collapses. We will be exposed to massive unrecoverable institutional defaults." "I do not care about his paranoid safeguards, Carter. You promised me this capital was completely secured." I sat perfectly still, my mind processing the devastating financial reality of their desperate conversation. The Kensingtons were completely broke. Their grand elite facade was entirely built on a crumbling foundation of massive debt and over-leveraged assets. They were not welcoming my daughter into a dynasty of immense generational wealth. They were actively using her as a desperate financial lifeline to save their sinking empire. They needed my $8 million to cover their disastrous international investments. Morgan's voice trembled slightly as she desperately tried to soothe Richard's sudden anger. "Richard, please, we are handling it. We have a solid contingency plan. We knew my father would never willingly sign over the leverage, and the bank will not accept digital authorization for a transaction of this magnitude." "Then how exactly do you plan to bypass a mandatory in-person notarized signature by Monday morning?" Patricia asked, her voice laced with cold, panicked urgency. Carter let out a slow, terrifyingly calm breath. The silence that followed was heavy with absolute, undeniable malice. "Because, Mother," Carter replied, his voice dropping to a sinister, conspiratorial whisper, "the actor is forging the legal signatures tomorrow afternoon in a private bank meeting." The words hung in the freezing air of the truck cabin. An actor. A hired imposter forging my signature to unlock $8 million of my hard-earned capital. But the sheer horror of their scheme did not end with a single fraudulent bank transfer. Through the tiny earpiece, the ambient noise of the grand ballroom faded completely, leaving only the sharp, calculating voices of my enemies. Richard Kensington was not satisfied with a single payout. His greed was a bottomless, starving pit. I listened as the older man let out a low hum, his tone dropping into a harsh, demanding whisper. The actor is fine for the rehearsal dinner, and the immediate liquidity, Richard stated, his words dripping with a cold, predatory pragmatism. But what about the permanent legal paperwork? The $8 million will barely cover our immediate institutional obligations. Have your lawyers finalized the conservatorship? My breath caught sharply in my throat. The temperature inside the vehicle seemed to plummet another 10 degrees. A conservatorship. The legal mechanism designed to completely strip an individual of their autonomy, their assets, and their basic human rights. They were not just trying to steal a fraction of my wealth. They were planning to steal my entire existence. I waited in the suffocating darkness, gripping the steering wheel, as I braced myself for my child to reply. I prayed for a fraction of hesitation, a single ounce of familial loyalty or moral regret. Instead, Morgan replied with a brisk, terrifyingly efficient cheerfulness. "Yes, Richard," she said, her voice entirely devoid of remorse. "My legal team has been thorough. With the fake medical records we procured from Dr. Eris, detailing his rapid, severe cognitive decline. The court petition is completely airtight. Once the judge signs off on the fabricated dementia diagnosis, I get full, uncontested power of attorney as his only child right after the honeymoon. He will be confined to the memory care facility, and I will have total access to the entire corporate portfolio." The sociopathic scale of her betrayal washed over me in dark, suffocating waves. My own flesh and blood, the child I had cradled in my arms and protected from every conceivable hardship, was actively orchestrating my legal and financial execution. She was plotting to lock me inside a medical prison, medicated and silenced, while she handed the keys of my life work to aristocratic parasites. The reality of her perfectly executed performance from that morning finally clicked into place. The fake tears, the desperate pleas for me to stay away from the wedding, the manufactured story about the rustic cabin in the woods. It was a meticulously designed delay tactic. She needed me isolated, distracted, and completely unaware of the legal machinations moving against me in the background. If I had simply stayed home wallowing in the manufactured grief of a rejected father, I would have woken up next week to a team of lawyers and medical orderlies knocking on my front door, armed with a court order to strip away my freedom. The anger simmering in my chest instantly hardened into something entirely different. It was no longer the fiery, reactive rage of a betrayed parent. It was the freezing, calculated focus of a wartime general facing a hostile invasion. I was a man who had built a sprawling commercial empire by outsmarting ruthless competitors and navigating treacherous corporate landscapes. I knew exactly how to dismantle structural threats. Morgan and the Kensingtons believed they had successfully cornered a clueless old man. They had absolutely no idea that they had just trapped themselves in a cage with an apex predator. As the chilling conversation smoothly transitioned back to the details of their rehearsal dinner, a sudden vibration shattered the tense silence of my truck cabin. I instinctively glanced down at the passenger seat. My secondary encrypted mobile phone was illuminating the darkness with a bright, persistent glow. The caller identification displayed the restricted number belonging to Derek Shaw. I reached out my hand, perfectly steady despite the massive adrenaline surging through my veins, and picked up the device. I kept the earpiece firmly planted in my right ear, monitoring the ongoing aristocratic chatter while I pressed the secure phone against my left ear. I answered the secure call with a single clipped command, telling the private investigator to immediately speak. Derek did not waste a single second with formal greetings. His voice was a rapid, urgent stream of hard, undeniable financial data. The veteran forensic accountant had spent the last several hours ruthlessly tearing through the guarded financial history of the Kensington family, and he had finally unearthed the massive, rotting core of their glittering facade. The final puzzle piece had just snapped into place. Harrison Derrick said, his gravelly voice cutting straight to the devastating point. The Kensingtons are not rich. The luxury cars, the Fifth Avenue penthouse, the diamonds, it is all an elaborate, heavily financed mirage. They are completely and utterly bankrupt. I listened in grim silence as Derek rapidly detailed the staggering scope of their absolute financial ruin. 2 years ago, Richard Kensington aggressively over-leveraged his family trust to fund a massive commercial real estate venture in the Middle East. The project had completely collapsed under a mountain of structural failures and severe regulatory violations. The toxic loans were instantly called in, exposing the family to catastrophic institutional defaults. They currently owed their primary creditors upward of $50 million. The grace period for those loans was set to expire next week. If they did not secure an immediate massive influx of liquid capital, the creditors were going to publicly seize every single one of their assets, permanently destroying their elite social standing and sending Richard to federal prison for aggressive financial fraud. The sheer audacity of their desperate survival plan echoed loudly in the cramped, freezing space of my vehicle. The Kensingtons were a sinking ship taking on water, and my daughter was the eager life raft they had manipulated to save themselves. They did not care about Morgan. They did not care about her happiness, her wedding, or her future. They only cared about the pristine commercial construction empire I had spent 40 years building. Morgan was nothing more than a highly gullible Trojan horse, a blind tool they were using to breach the walls of my fortune. By manipulating her deep, pathetic desire for social validation, they convinced her to betray the only person who had ever truly loved her. They were using my own child to seize the assets of my company under a fraudulent conservatorship, fully intending to violently liquidate my life work to pay off their toxic loans. I sat in the dark alleyway, listening to the dual audio streams of the joyful laughter of my daughter in one ear and the cold facts of her imminent destruction in the other. They thought they had brilliantly orchestrated the perfect crime. They believed they were days away from claiming ultimate victory over a broken, silenced man. They had absolutely no idea that I now possessed every single piece of their treasonous puzzle, and I was going to use it to burn their fraudulent world straight to the ground. I pulled the small black earpiece from my right ear, breaking the wireless connection that had just delivered the absolute destruction of my family. The sudden silence inside the freezing cabin of my truck was absolute heavy and completely suffocating. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat, my calloused hands resting lightly on the bottom of the cold leather steering wheel. Beyond the frosted glass of the windshield, the dark Manhattan sky had finally opened up. Tiny crystalline flakes of early winter snow began to drift slowly down into the narrow, shadowed alleyway, illuminated only by the harsh, flickering amber glow of a distant street lamp. Each delicate snowflake landed silently against the cold glass, melting instantly into small, jagged streams of freezing water that mirrored the absolute desolation, settling deep within my chest. But as I sat there staring out into the bleak, freezing urban landscape, a profound realization washed over my mind. I did not shed a single tear. There was no sudden, overwhelming wave of grief. There was no desperate, agonizing desire to call my daughter and beg for a fragile reconciliation. The sorrow that should have shattered my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces had been completely and instantly incinerated. In its place, a freezing, indestructible glacier of absolute resolve had firmly taken root. My only child, the young woman I had carried on my shoulders and worked grueling, brutal double shifts to protect, was not simply embarrassed by my working-class background. She was actively, aggressively conspiring with a family of bankrupt aristocrats to steal my entire life's work and permanently lock me in an asylum. The sheer horrifying magnitude of their coordinated criminal scheme played on an endless, terrifying loop in my mind. They were not merely plotting a standard corporate hostile takeover or attempting a quiet financial embezzlement. They were meticulously planning to medically erase my entire existence from the world. My daughter was going to use fabricated medical documents to declare me legally incompetent, stripping away my basic human autonomy. She intended to lock me inside the sterile, heavily medicated walls of a secure memory care facility, abandoning me to rot in isolation, while she enthusiastically handed over the keys to my sprawling commercial construction empire. She was fully prepared to let Richard Kensington violently liquidate the massive corporate portfolio I had spent 4 agonizing decades building from the ground up, all to pay off the catastrophic $50 million toxic debt he had recklessly accumulated in Dubai. They viewed me as nothing more than a disposable breathing bank account, a stubborn physical obstacle standing between their bankrupt reality and their desperate salvation. They had calculated my profound paternal love as my greatest, most exploitable weakness. They assumed my deep affection for Morgan would render me completely blind to their rapidly advancing knives. I closed my eyes, visualizing the intricate, hidden structural beams of my corporate empire. They thought they were quietly undermining my foundation, preparing for a sudden, devastating collapse. But they had profoundly misunderstood the fundamental nature of the man they were attempting to destroy. I am a commercial builder. I have spent my entire adult life turning raw, unforgiving materials into towering monuments of steel and concrete. I know exactly how to identify a fatal structural flaw, and I know exactly how to execute a controlled, devastating demolition. The Kensingtons believed they held all the powerful cards in this treacherous game of high society deception. They thought their polished, aristocratic manipulation was vastly superior to my blue-collar grit. But their entire strategy relied entirely on my continued blissful ignorance. By confirming their massive, catastrophic debt, Derek Shaw had handed me the absolute blueprint to their total destruction. I opened my eyes, the cold, analytical focus of a wartime general, completely overriding the lingering shadows of a betrayed father. I did not need to confront them. I did not need to march into that grand ballroom, cause a massive, embarrassing public scene, and demand answers from a daughter who had already proven she was a pathological liar. A public confrontation would only give Richard Kensington the precious, vital time he needed to scramble his legal defenses and accelerate the fraudulent conservatorship filings. I needed to move with absolute, devastating precision. I needed to fundamentally alter the entire legal and financial landscape before they even realized the ground beneath their feet had violently shifted. I needed to become their absolute worst nightmare. I reached across the dark cabin of the truck and picked up my secure corporate mobile phone. The screen cast a harsh, bright blue light across my face in the freezing darkness. My wet fingertips traced the cold plastic casing of the device, grounding me firmly in the absolute reality of this horrifying nightmare. I needed to move with a level of calculated extreme aggression that these truly pathetic, entirely bankrupt socialites could never even begin to comprehend. They had vastly underestimated the sheer brutal strength of a deeply betrayed father. I bypassed the standard contacts and navigated directly to my highly encrypted corporate directory. I scrolled past the project managers, the regional directors, and the union representatives, stopping firmly on a specific, highly prioritized name. Mitchell Reed was not just a lawyer. He was a vicious, highly aggressive corporate bulldog. He was the brilliant, ruthless legal mind I retained specifically for dismantling hostile competitors and executing complex high-stakes corporate warfare. He was notorious in the financial district for his absolute lack of mercy and his terrifyingly efficient legal maneuvers. He was the exact weapon I needed to deploy against the Kensington family. I checked the digital clock illuminated on the dashboard. It was nearly midnight on a Saturday. For any other attorney, this would be an unforgivable intrusion. For Mitchell, it was merely the opening bell of a highly lucrative engagement. I pressed the green call button and raised the phone to my ear, listening to the steady, rhythmic ringing of the secure connection. The cold winter wind began to howl fiercely through the narrow, dark Manhattan alley, gently rocking the heavy steel frame of my parked truck. The line clicked open on the 4th ring. Mitchell answered with a sharp, alert, professional greeting, completely devoid of sleep. He knew that when I called his secure line in the middle of the night, massive, sweeping corporate movements were immediately required. I did not offer a polite apology for the late hour, nor did I waste time explaining the tragic, heartbreaking, emotional nuances of my daughter's terrible betrayal. I kept my voice perfectly level, dropping the temperature of the conversation to match the freezing snow rapidly piling up on my cold windshield. I delivered my directives with the precise, uncompromising authority of a man who was fully prepared to burn his entire world to the ground in order to eliminate a terminal threat. I stared at the swirling snow and spoke directly into the phone. Mitchell, wake up the board. We are going to war. I want to buy a massive amount of toxic debt, and I want my company moved into a blind trust by tomorrow morning. We are going to execute a corporate slaughter. The next 2 weeks were an absolute masterclass in ruthless corporate warfare. I did not step foot outside my study, transforming the dark mahogany room into a highly secure command center. While Morgan and her newly adopted aristocratic family gleefully assumed I was sitting alone in Philadelphia, drowning in the pathetic sorrow of a rejected, dementia-ridden old man, I was actively dismantling their entire financial existence. Mitchell Reed arrived at my estate before the sun even crested the horizon the following morning, bringing with him a specialized team of shark-like financial analysts and aggressive corporate litigators. They set up secure servers and encrypted communication lines, bypassing all of my standard wealth management channels to ensure Morgan would never receive a single automated alert. We operated in absolute silence. I instructed Mitchell to access my secondary, deeply hidden offshore investment portfolios, liquidating massive conservative bond holdings that I had quietly accumulated over the past 30 years. These were emergency funds that not even my late wife had fully known about, completely untethered from the heavily monitored trust accounts Morgan was currently attempting to breach. We needed an astronomical amount of liquid capital, and we needed it available within 48 hours. Mitchell moved with terrifying efficiency, securing the capital and immediately establishing a series of untraceable shell corporations designed to completely mask my identity from the international market. Once the lethal financial machinery was firmly in place, we turned our unwavering crosshairs directly onto the sprawling, toxic debt belonging to Richard Kensington. The brilliant private investigator Derek Shaw had provided us with a flawless roadmap of the aristocratic family's catastrophic failure in Dubai. We possessed the exact names of their primary institutional creditors, the specific banking syndicates that were holding the $50 million in defaulted loans. Those foreign banks were currently bleeding, desperate to offload the toxic, non-performing assets from their heavily scrutinized balance sheets before the end of the fiscal year. They were highly motivated, incredibly anxious sellers. Mitchell initiated contact through our newly formed shell companies, adopting the aggressive posture of a ruthless vulture fund looking to acquire high-risk international debt for a fraction of its original value. The intense negotiations were brief, brutal, and breathtakingly successful. We did not purchase the Kensingtons' massive debt for pennies on the dollar. We bought the absolute entirety of their $50 million obligation at a steep discount, legally absorbing every single punitive interest rate penalty clause and immediate collection right attached to the original loans. The foreign banks were thrilled to wash their hands of the massive Middle Eastern failure, completely unaware that they were handing me the ultimate devastating weapon. By the end of the first week, the massive international transaction formally cleared the global financial wire. I sat at my desk and stared at the final legally binding acquisition documents, feeling a chilling wave of absolute power wash over my mind. Richard Kensington was no longer desperately indebted to a faceless consortium of overseas banking executives. His entire fraudulent empire, his Fifth Avenue penthouse, his luxury vehicles, and his carefully curated high society image now belonged entirely to me. I had successfully become their sole supreme creditor. I literally owned the Kensington family. The $50 million guillotine was now suspended directly over their heads, and I was the only man holding the incredibly frayed rope. But acquiring the power to destroy my enemies was only the first half of my comprehensive defensive strategy. I still needed to permanently secure the vast commercial construction empire I had spent 40 years building with my bare hands. I had to ensure that Morgan's twisted sociopathic plan to seize my assets through a fraudulent medical conservatorship was rendered completely and legally impossible. I instructed Mitchell to begin the immediate sweeping transfer of every single corporate asset, real estate holding, and private banking account associated with my name. We drafted an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust, a formidable legal fortress, completely governed by an independent, highly aggressive institutional trustee. I willingly signed over 100% of my company, effectively removing myself as the direct legal owner of the business I had bled for. I transferred the sprawling stone colonial, the massive corporate operating funds, and the entirety of my private wealth directly into the ironclad protection of the trust. To the outside world, and more importantly, to the greedy, calculating eyes of any hostile family court judge in Manhattan, my personal net worth was instantly reduced to absolute zero. If Morgan somehow managed to drag a corrupt medical professional into a courtroom to declare me mentally incompetent, she would be fighting to gain control of a completely empty vault. There would be absolutely nothing left for her to extract. The golden goose she had promised to deliver to her bankrupt aristocratic in-laws was already dead and buried. The final necessary step of the operation was the most painful, but I executed it with a completely frozen heart. I called my primary medical providers and my personal estate attorneys, initiating a rapid, comprehensive overhaul of my advanced directives. I systematically stripped Morgan of any and all legal standing in my life. I formally revoked her medical proxy permanently, erasing her ability to make healthcare decisions on my behalf. I nullified her status as my next of kin, replacing her with the ruthless legal team at Mitchell's firm. I systematically struck her name from every single wealth management account, severing her access to the generous monthly interest disbursements she had enjoyed for her entire adult life. I even ordered my corporate security director to immediately cancel the fleet registration on her precious Porsche Macan, effectively stranding her in her own web of lies. I built a towering, indestructible wall of legal armor around myself, ensuring that I was now entirely, undeniably untouchable. Her disgusting, calculated fantasy of locking me inside a sterile memory care facility while she danced in designer gowns was officially eradicated. With the massive corporate slaughter perfectly prepared and waiting in the shadows, a strange, profound silence settled back over my estate. The frantic, aggressive energy of the legal war room faded as Mitchell and his team finalized the last remaining signatures. The trap was now fully set, expertly concealed beneath the glittering, superficial facade of their aristocratic dreams. I spent the remaining days leading up to the final event in quiet, absolute solitude, mentally preparing myself for the inevitable explosive confrontation. The weather outside grew increasingly bitter, wrapping the sprawling grounds of my home in a thick, unforgiving blanket of freezing white snow. The heavy, beautiful winter storm perfectly matched the cold, uncompromising landscape of my battered soul. Time marched constantly forward, with a relentless, mechanical precision, silently ticking down the final hours of my daughter's elaborate, deceitful fantasy. The sun finally dipped below the gray, freezing horizon, plunging the world into a stark, freezing darkness. It was now officially New Year's Eve. The single most anticipated, highly exclusive night of the Manhattan social calendar had finally arrived. The grand $500,000 luxury wedding at the Plaza Hotel was just a few short hours away from formally commencing, and I was completely ready. The heavy oak doors of the Plaza Hotel swung open, admitting a rush of freezing winter wind that was instantly swallowed by the overwhelming warmth of the opulent lobby. I stepped over the polished marble threshold, brushing a thin layer of freshly fallen snow from the broad shoulders of my tailored black overcoat. The atmosphere inside the iconic building was absolutely electric. It was New Year's Eve in Manhattan, and the air was thick with the intoxicating scent of expensive perfume, winter pine, and pure, unfiltered wealth. Wealthy socialites in designer tuxedos and sparkling evening gowns glided effortlessly past me, completely unaware of the devastating corporate execution that was about to unfold within these gilded walls. I did not make my way toward the grand staircase or the private elevators leading to the main ballroom. I had no intention of physically crashing the lavish $500,000 spectacle taking place on the upper floors. I stepped quietly into the shadows near the famous Palm Court, positioning myself perfectly to observe the sprawling lounge area and the massive ornate digital screens mounted above the polished mahogany bars. Up there in the glittering epicenter of high society, 500 elite guests were currently sipping vintage champagne and exchanging hollow aristocratic pleasantries. Morgan was undoubtedly holding court in her custom Vera Wang gown, radiating the fabricated innocence of a beloved daughter. And standing right beside her, flawlessly executing his highly compensated performance, was the veteran Broadway actor they had hired to replace me. He was likely smiling warmly, swirling a glass of expensive wine, and effortlessly playing the role of the distinguished, socially acceptable patriarch. They had built a spectacular, breathtakingly expensive monument to their own vanity, completely oblivious to the fact that I had already wired the entire structure with financial explosives. A lesser man might have barged into that ballroom, kicking open the heavy mahogany doors and shouting the ugly truth for every politician and Wall Street executive to hear. A weaker father might have caused a massive, embarrassing public spectacle, desperately demanding a tearful explanation from a daughter who had proven herself completely devoid of a human soul. But I refused to give them the immense satisfaction of a chaotic, emotional confrontation. A screaming match would only validate their deeply held snobbish belief that I was nothing more than a crude, unpolished laborer who could not control his temper in civilized society. Furthermore, a physical disruption would have given Richard Kensington the chaotic distraction he so desperately needed to formulate a viable legal defense. I was a master commercial builder. I knew that the absolute most effective demolitions were perfectly silent right until the exact moment the charges detonated. I wanted their destruction to be cold, clinical, and absolutely inescapable. I remained perfectly still in the bustling lobby, blending seamlessly into the luxurious background, while the heavy steel trap finally snapped completely shut around their fragile, bankrupt reality. Standing just a few feet away from my concealed position, casually sipping sparkling mineral water and checking their smartphones, was a highly specialized, fiercely aggressive investigative team from the premier financial news network in the entire country. I had not simply called the local police to report a quiet case of domestic fraud. That would have been entirely too small for the staggering magnitude of their betrayal. 48 hours prior, I had anonymously couriered the complete unredacted forensic accounting files directly to their lead evening anchor. The documents meticulously detailed every single catastrophic failure of the Kensington family's massive international real estate venture, the subsequent corporate cover-up, and the $50 million in deeply toxic debt they had desperately tried to hide from their institutional investors. I also provided absolute irrefutable proof that a single, anonymous corporate entity had aggressively purchased the entirety of that defaulted debt, permanently cornering the aristocratic family in a lethal financial trap. The journalists did not know my true identity, but they knew they were currently holding the absolute biggest corporate scandal of the decade. They had quietly positioned their aggressive camera crews in the grand lobby and immediately outside the main hotel entrances, waiting patiently for the designated network embargo to formally lift. I checked my heavy gold wristwatch. It was exactly 8:45 in the evening. The relentless mechanical ticking of the sweeping second hand felt exactly like the steady beating of an ancient war drum. Upstairs, the extravagant rehearsal dinner was likely reaching its elegant, carefully choreographed climax. The hired actor was probably preparing to deliver a heartfelt, completely fabricated toast to the happy couple sealing the grand illusion for their wealthy, oblivious guests. Morgan would be smiling, her brightest smile completely convinced she had successfully neutralized me and securely fastened her place within the glittering ranks of the exclusive Manhattan elite. She genuinely believed she had brilliantly outsmarted a clueless, blue-collar old man. She firmly thought the fraudulent medical records were safely tucked away, just waiting to be legally filed on Monday morning to permanently strip away my freedom and aggressively drain my life's work. She had absolutely no idea that the targeted bank accounts she intended to violently loot were already completely empty, the vast assets rapidly transferred into an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust. She did not know that her medical proxy had been legally incinerated. Most importantly, she did not know that the powerful, wealthy family she was desperately marrying into was completely, hopelessly insolvent. I stood silently in the luxurious shadows, my face a hard mask of absolute freezing calm. The profound, suffocating sorrow of losing my only child had been completely burned away, leaving only a sharp, terrifyingly clear focus. I was about to execute a corporate slaughter of unprecedented proportions. The ambient, joyful noise of the crowded hotel lounge seemed to slowly fade into a dull, distant hum as the ticking clock moved closer to the top of the hour. 8:55. 8:58. The seasoned financial journalists standing near the mahogany bar suddenly tensed their professional demeanor, instantly shifting into high gear as they received the final network confirmation through their hidden earpieces. The veteran camera operators discreetly lifted their broadcast equipment, aiming their powerful lenses directly toward the massive digital screens mounted prominently above the crowded bar. I kept my cold eyes locked firmly on the glowing displays, my heart beating with slow, powerful, measured strikes. The Kensingtons had arrogantly chosen to play a ruthless game of financial survival, callously using my own flesh and blood as a disposable pawn. Now they were going to brutally learn what actually happened when you invited a true apex predator into your vulnerable home. The digital clock on the marble wall shifted to 9 in the evening. Instantly, the regular festive programming completely vanished from every television screen in the sprawling hotel lounge. The bright flashing graphics of a massive breaking news alert filled the crowded venue. The audio volume from the ceiling speakers abruptly surged, cutting through the sophisticated chatter of the wealthy patrons. The bold, glaring red headline crawled across the bottom of the television screens, announcing the total annihilation of their stolen world. Kensington Empire collapses, fraud investigation launched. The camera smoothly panned up from the glaring red text, and my own face completely filled the massive screens displayed across the luxury lounge. I was not the confused, broken invalid my daughter had so eagerly described to her elite guests just 20 hours prior. I was wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, my posture rigid, my eyes staring directly into the camera lens with cold, calculating authority. The crisp audio from the live broadcast echoed loudly through the suddenly silent lobby, instantly capturing the absolute shock of wealthy patrons standing around me. I spoke with a steady, uncompromising voice, formally announcing that my newly formed private investment firm had officially foreclosed on every single defaulted asset belonging to the Kensington family. I ruthlessly detailed their massive institutional failures and the $50 million toxic debt they had desperately tried to hide from their high society peers. They planned to lock me in an asylum, but I had decisively locked them out of my wealth and their freedom. Then I delivered the final devastating blow. I paused briefly, looking straight into the glowing lens, knowing perfectly well that my daughter was watching this exact broadcast unfold in the grand ballroom directly above me. The anchor remained silent, allowing my declaration to resonate across the nation. I let the weight of my retaliation strike with absolute precision. Furthermore, I stated publicly, my voice ringing clearly through the Grand Hotel, I want to clarify that I am in perfect mental health. Any claims to the contrary are entirely fraudulent. Effective immediately, I am cutting all personal and financial ties with my daughter Morgan due to her active involvement in a criminal financial conspiracy. The luxurious silence of the iconic hotel instantly shattered. From the upper floors, I could hear the muffled sounds of absolute chaos violently erupting inside the sprawling venue. The polite clinking of crystal champagne flutes was suddenly replaced by panicked shouting, the harsh echoing crash of breaking glass, and the frantic murmurs of a ruined dynasty realizing their complete destruction. They were officially trapped in an incredibly expensive cage of their own desperate making. Outside the heavy glass doors, the shrill, piercing wail of police sirens tore through the freezing New York night. Derek had forwarded the comprehensive forensic evidence of Richard Kensington and his financial fraud directly to the federal authorities just minutes before the news aired. The violently flashing red and blue lights painted the marble lobby as a dozen heavily armed uniformed officers marched aggressively through the entrance, entirely bypassing the bewildered hotel staff and heading straight for the private elevators. Just as the stern authorities disappeared upstairs, a frantic, desperate figure suddenly appeared at the top of the grand staircase. Morgan stumbled blindly down the carpeted steps in her sprawling custom Vera Wang gown. Her immaculate bridal hair was a wild, tangled mess, and her face was completely pale with sheer, undeniable terror. She saw me standing quietly in the shadows near the bar and ran frantically toward me, her incredibly heavy silk dress dragging along the highly polished floor. She fell heavily to her knees at my feet, sobbing hysterically, screaming my name, desperately begging for a salvation she no longer deserved. I looked silently down at her wet, tear-stained face, my expression carved from solid stone. Upstairs, the police were officially handcuffing Carter and his corrupt father. Their glamorous empire was officially dead. There was no fairy tale ending waiting for her tonight, only the harsh, unforgiving reality of a federal indictment and complete, undeniable ruin. "You wanted me to disappear from your wedding," I told her, my voice perfectly calm and entirely devoid of mercy. "I just honored your wish. Happy New Year, Morgan." I turned my back on her frantic, echoing sobs and walked out through the heavy doors into the freezing cold and crisp New York winter night. In life, the most dangerous betrayals rarely come from your enemies. They come from those you sheltered from the storm. When you spend your entire life building a fortress to protect your loved ones, ensure you are not unknowingly raising the very people who will lock you out of it. Wealth can provide comfort, but it cannot buy character, integrity, or loyalty. True strength is not just about how much you can provide. It is knowing exactly when to stop giving to those who mistake your generosity for weakness. Let them face the cold. It is the only way they will ever learn. Have you ever discovered a shocking betrayal from someone you sacrificed everything for? How did you handle the truth? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful life lessons.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low, but the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.